So maybe king shows up a whole lot in our hymns because it rhymes so easily with sing. Let heaven and nature sing, and Christ is the King. I woke up this morning, the alarm clock came on, and it was a Christmas carol. And the Christmas carol, one that we didn't sing today, talked about how Christ is King. It was really, really cool. There's an old Jewish little story that was told about how whenever you encountered someone on the street, someone that had also been made in the image of God, whether they were richer than you or poorer than you, whether they were older than you or younger than you, whether they were the same color skin as you or a different color of skin as you, whether they were the same sex or the opposite sex, regardless, there was an image of the king or the queen in that person, the icon of God, that they were created in the image of God. And the story was just that the angels would all of a sudden blow trumpets, kind of like our ensemble today, that the angels would blow trumpets and say, bum, 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 and make way for an icon of the blessed Holy One. What a wonderful world it would be if we saw God, Christ, in everyone that we encountered, everywhere. And we looked at them and we looked at them and we saw them, and they looked at us and saw us. What a different world it would be. So there's a story. It's called The Quilt Maker's Gift. And many of you are quilt makers, and many of you are giving people. But this story is called was written by Jeff Brumbaugh and Gail DeMarkin, called The Quilt Maker's Gift. And it says something about kings, and it says something about what Jesus did today with Pontius Pilate. Who was interrogating who? Who was more of God's representative in that little story? So the quilt maker's gift goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was a quilt maker, and she lived way up high up on a mountain, up in the clouds. And the quilt maker made beautiful quilts. Her blues were bluer than the bluest sky, and her whites were more feathery than the clouds that floated across the sky. The reds and the oranges and the yellow were like the fall leaves that came down, and the greens like the spring grass that would pop up out of the ground. Her quilts were incredible. And every night, this quilt maker would go down from her high mountain, down to the town and the village below, and look for kings and queens to give her quilts away to. These kings and queens all had something in common. They were poor, they were homeless, they were sleeping out in the cold. And so she would share her beautiful hand-stitched quilt with these individuals. Well, living in the land, there was also a king. This king had everything the king ever wanted, but this king was never happy. This king never smiled. This king kept a list of all the different gifts the king had received and who had given this king gifts. In fact, the king had made a royal decree. Every year, I'm going to celebrate my birthday twice, so I get birthday gifts twice a year. This king had everything the king could ever want. But one day the king was going through his list and saw that there was one person in the kingdom who had never given him a gift, and that was the quilt maker. How dare someone not give me a gift? And he summoned his soldiers to go visit this quilt maker. They returned by saying the quilt maker doesn't sell her gifts. The quilt maker only gives her quilts away. The king said, we'll see about that. And so he took some of his army men, and he took some gold and some other gifts up to the quilt maker. But she says, nope, not for sale. And he says, I must have one of your quilts. And she said, well, if you want to have a quilt, give your things away. Give your gifts as presents to others in the kingdom. And then I'll make you a quilt. The king said, I can't do that, and got really, really mad, and took her, or had the soldiers take her. They put her in a bear cave, chained her into the bear cave with a sleeping bear. The king went back to the palace, and that night the king wrestled with sleeping. And he kept thinking about this quilt maker in this bear cave, just knowing that the bear was going to eat her alive. The next morning, he went with his soldiers to the bear cave, only to find the quilt maker and the bear eating honey and drinking tea together. It seems that overnight, the bear had awoken, and the quilt maker had said, you are a grouchy bear. You don't have anything to sleep on. Go get me some leaves and some pine needles, and I will make you a pillow and a bed soft as can be. And the bear did and slept wonderfully. And then the next morning, he and his new friend, the quilt maker, were having honey and tea. The king was outraged once again. He had his soldiers take this quilt maker out and put her on an island that was only as big enough to put her tippy toes on. And she stood out on the island in the middle of the sea with just tiptoes. And then the army left her, the military left her right there. During the night, the king couldn't sleep again. He was worried about this quilt maker out on this little rock in the middle of the sea. And the next morning, he went out to the end of the shore to see if he could see her out there or to see what had happened to her, only to find her in a tree on the shore. How did you get here? And she was up in the tree, and she was quilt making or knitting little tiny vests for all the sparrows that had come to her out on that rock. Cold, shivering, she made little sparrow vests for them all. And then they flew her to the tree where she continued making sparrow vests and sweaters for all the birds of the air. The king said, "What must I do to get one of your quilts? If all of heaven and nature takes care of you, what can I do?" And she said, "Again, give your stuff away." The king wrestled with this and finally searched everything and came up with one little tiny marble that he gave to a little boy. He gave the marble to a little boy, and the boy had such a great smile and such delight that the king said, "I might try that again." And then the king went and got a couple more marbles, and then got a cloak, and then got some other things and started giving them away. The king started feeling a little bit better, still not smiling, but one thing led to another, and the king kept giving things away, one after the other. As the quilt maker heard about this, she began making a quilt for the king. One thing led to another, and months and even years went by, and the king kept giving away the king's things, including the whole merry-go-round that the king owned. And once he saw the children on the merry-go-round, he went out and he rode the merry-go-round with them and laughed and smiled. And all the people that received the king's cloaks and clothes danced and paraded, and he joined in the dance and the parade. When he finally was out of everything, the quilt maker came to him one night with a quilt. He just smiled and said, "I don't need a quilt. I have everything. I have joy, I have happiness, I have peace now, thanks to you." She said, "But I made a promise I would give you this quilt." And he said, "Well, then I insist on giving you my last possession. It's the throne chair. It's a pretty comfortable chair if you would like to make quilts sitting in the throne chair." She accepted his offer. She continued to make quilts day after day, and night after night. The king would go to her and take her quilts with his holes in his boots and his clothes in tatters, and he would take her quilts and give them to other people all over the world. The quilt maker's gift. It reminds me that I'm often like that king in the story. Challenged what it means to be a king, challenged about sharing things, challenged about greedily possessing things, challenged sometimes by the love of Jesus Christ, the forgiveness by the grace of how I'm called to live. The quilt maker, like Jesus, stood up to an evil king. The quilt maker, like Jesus, stood up to Pontius Pilate. The quilt maker stood up to the king. She said, "Here's what you got to do in order to receive this gift." She stood up to the king. Sometimes as Christians, called to be Christ-like, we're called to stand up to the evil powers of this world, to the forces that be, to the devil and Satan and all his empty promises, as we're going to say in a moment in the affirmation of baptism. We're called also to wrestle with what it means to be royalty and created in God's image, as Genesis 1 says. We wrestle with even Christ as king. In John chapter 18, less than 20 verses later, Jesus is crucified, wearing not a crown of royalty, but a crown of thorns, right? And 5 chapters earlier in John 13, Jesus basically gets on his knees and washes his feet, saying, this is the kind of king I am. I've come to serve you. And like our boys and girls told me a while ago, if we're kings and queens, then we are called to serve others like Christ serves us. We're called to help protect, called to wrestle with what it means to be Christian, Christian, and Christ as our King. Let's sing a couple more songs about Christ the King Sunday, including this great Easter hymn.